going to start with the idea, hopefully, if you're not already on this page, of why diversity and inclusion matters in data teams. So given that most of us will be data or tech specialists, I do love a good statistic. I'm hoping you do as well. And you can click on that source to read another 81 statistics around the benefits of diversity and inclusion. So these are some key ones that I put out on this slide. I think it's just really important to see that not only a diverse and inclusive team is the right thing to do, but statistically, companies that are diverse and inclusive actually perform far better than those that are not. Yeah, Andrew.
I think that's a real point to press upon, and it's something over the last 2 to 3 years that companies have begun to realize. With the McKinsey report in 2019, they really stressed the point that if you have diversity on your executive teams, on your leadership teams, you're 21% more likely to outperform your competitors in profitability. And people actually went to McKinsey and queried that, and they said, yes, we can demonstrate in different areas across different domains where this is added value. So I think the points that Kat's raised here really are underpinned with the performance of some of the companies we've seen, particularly in this sector when it comes to technology.
Only 16% of director level and above data leaders in the UK are women. That's one that I didn't put up there. So clearly in the UK, in the data space, there is work to be done here. So those of you on the call today, hopefully this will be a call to action over the next hour or two. Matthew Said, the author of the book Rebel Ideas, The Power of Diverse Thinking, has given a really powerful example about how a lack of diversity in the CIA was one of the reasons that they failed to spot the 9/11 plot. The CIA for many, many years was one of those top, well, still is, I'm sure, one of those top institutions to aim for, that their hiring practices were consistently bringing in the same type of people, and diversity can be directly linked to that gross failure by the intelligence agencies in the US. So this is a fairly extreme example. It's not a life or death matter for hardly any of us, but some data teams can absolutely have a positive or negative impact on society with their work. So let's look at 3 examples. And just before we do, here's 5 quotes from some of the world's most influential change agents about diversity and inclusion, which you can read while I'm talking. So the first example, I'm referencing that statistic from the previous slide where inclusive companies are 1.7 times more innovative. Data and tech teams are absolutely at the forefront of innovation in our companies. And it's not just about knowing the best new technology to meet the company's corporate vision. This is a key element, of course, but it's about how you realize a corporate vision through data and technology. It's about how you transform old ways of going about the running of a business. I mean, the classic example I think that many of you might be living through right now is moving away from static canned reports in spreadsheets to things like next best action, real-time push notifications, dashboarding where you can drill down and understand the data, growing data literacy. All of these are highly innovative things. So this does generally relate to data and tech teams. And people don't like change generally. I think that's a fairly well-known sort of stereotype. And many can't easily imagine new futures. So that's why innovation is so important in data and tech teams. And you need a diverse range of skill sets to be innovative. And Andy, is there anything you want to add there?
Well, I'd say that given the industries that you've been a part of, you've seen where the innovation by technology and specifically data has been utilized to generate more revenue or to reduce cost. These are the underlying things that all stakeholders are looking for in successful businesses. And for me, when you're looking at innovation, they're going out to different areas of the marketplace where they haven't been before. And they're taking into those marketplaces products which they hope will be successful. Now, you need to be cognizant of the people that you're serving for that product to be successful. And for all intents purposes, having them involved in the innovation process means you're much more likely to be successful with that.
The next reason of why diversity and inclusion is of a benefit to a data team is about being reflective of the customer base. McKinsey in the US wrote this really long paper only months ago. I've provided the link further on in the deck. It's about how predictive analytics instead of traditional methods of customer surveys can improve the customer experience, CX. And here's a quote: "The CX programs of the future will be holistic, predictive, precise, and clearly tied to business outcomes. Evidence suggests that the advantages will be substantial for companies that start building the capabilities, talent, and organizational structure needed for this transition. Those that stick with the traditional systems will be forced to play catch up in the years to come," which is a theme that Andrew's already talked about. Now, in terms of talent and org structure that they quoted there, they do mention in the article about bringing business and data teams more closely together in a cross-functional team as a way of ensuring that analytics are fit for purpose. That's not a particularly mind-blowing new piece of information, but they actually fail to explicitly mention the risk that predictive analytics won't meet customer needs if it's not designed by a diverse team. And I think that's a really important point for you all to be aware of, those especially working in the data science and the analytics and reporting space. That diversity, the teams that are designing the solutions definitely need to be representative of their customer base.
We've seen the impact when it's not, where products which essentially everybody in the room was only thinking happy path and not taking into account the fact that systematic biases they were building into their products, not having data sets that reflected all of the community or the diverse nature of the population, meant that other people were badly affected by the outcome of that. We've seen that with CVs that they were grading at various different companies. They've tried to automate that process. We've seen there's a number of different scenarios in which I could highlight on the call, which it hasn't worked out. And that's basically because all the people in the room were only cognizant of one thing. They weren't thinking of the demographic or the representing the people they're actually need to solve solutions for. And this is why representation is so important. Inclusivity is so important. And I think it bears reflection specifically on the technology we're using today. When you look at what we're encoding, who owns the code? Who's it written by? Where were they influenced? These are key matters as we move on. I'll add some highlights later on.
Well, it segues very neatly into the next and last point of an example. This is actually the most obvious example of why D&I is critical for data teams. You only have to Google the phrase racial bias in machine learning training data to see just how big a problem has been uncovered by researchers in this area. Andrew, why don't you give a more personal example of this?
Oh yeah, in 2019, I think it was, two of my family members were stopped in the city of London, and a conversation that should have been fairly easy to have was made significantly difficult. And when you realize that was down to the fact that they were picked out by a facial recognition software, the data they were using was wrong, and the data sets that they had leveraged in their MVP, as it was, the police organization, I would say that it didn't benefit from good data quality. And because of these missing elements in what they took out into the public, it wasn't fit for purpose, and there were negative results. And you know, watching the young men, as it were, go through that process, seeing it firsthand, brought home to me that the industry that I'm involved in needs to be more cognizant of these facts.
And that's 2 people on the call today. So imagine how big a problem that is. So I'm going to pause for a minute. We're going to get a lot more sort of touchy-feely in the next 2 sections. So Oscar, I can't actually see either the chat or people wishing to speak and ask questions because of the way that I'm presenting.
Yes,
so can I ask you to be a bit of a sort of a host there? Is there anything that we should stop and quickly cover that's come up so far?
We have someone mentioning that this, I believe the being stopped issue has happened in other places as well. Utterly ridiculous, says Ash. Ash, do you want to elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, when I did my machine learning module at uni, there was an example of a city in America. I remember that it wasn't London, but I can't remember exactly where, but I think Microsoft developed it, and they basically trained on white people, and everyone involved must have been like, either we can't get the data or we don't need the data.
Yeah, they've done several trials from what I've read and from, you know, people I've spoken to. I mean, I think some of the scenarios where they've used it in transport networks and things like that, they tried to use specific types of data in specific types of scenarios. And I think as they've now expanded it out to be much more cloud orientated and facilitating the API to be called by any and anybody, there needs to be much more cognizant fact that this is being used and in daily life, not just from facial recognition, but from credit scoring, from medical records. These kind of things are being correlated and 360 patterns are being established.
Excellent, thank you. And one other thing I'll mention that's from the chat, because you can't see it, is that I believe we can hear your trackpad clicking. If you happen to have a mouse nearby, otherwise it's not a big issue. It's just it's being picked up by the microphone, just to let you know.
Oh, okay.
I did just see that on the chat. So as long as you can just see the slides and not all of my speaking notes, which has happened previously, just have to deal with the trackpad, I'm afraid. So.
Oh, joyful.
All right, let's keep diving further in. Now we're going to get a lot more real. So this section is the first section we talked about, just setting the scene and the groundwork of why D&I is really important. But I'd like to take the time now to really unpack these concepts. For those of you that have not done a lot of research or your own personal development in this area, what is this all about? What are we talking about? So I've got 7 terms. Let's start with the most obvious one. The term is everywhere right now, and it does what it says on the tin. But I do, however, want to mention 2 points which are less talked about in relation to diversity. Firstly, when we think about diversity in organizations, we tend to think of race, sex, and sexual orientation or gender. But increasingly we are in data teams, especially talking about neurodiversity. But diversity is truly what this definition says. It's celebrating the fact that we're all unique. Let's take Andrew and I. Yes, he's black and I'm white. He's a cis male and I'm a cis female. He is straight and I am gay. And yes, these identities have absolutely impacted our respective experience of the workplace. but it was our differences in personalities and methodologies that really showed up when we were on the same team. I'm highly structured and he's much more free-flowing. I try to get my points across quickly, whereas he builds relationships and trust through talking. Now, this diversity was really critical to the success of our team, but it was not easy to navigate. I particularly found it really difficult. And Andrew, I know that you struggled at times. Do you want to share?
Well, I call it a learning experience. After all these years, I think my approach has generally been in situations where you need to explain an awful lot of content. You don't have a lot of time, but you need to build relationships with many people to deliver something. And generally speaking, it's something very complex. It's going to involve change, whereas taking a structured and methodical approach, I still can't say that word no matter how many times I try. I think that also gets results but does it differently. So it's trying to find that balance between the two, or leveraging one bit where it works and you're leveraging another bit where it works too, which actually made our program work. Driving a lot of change, introducing new technology and new ways of working is not easy, and people only really see the value when it's there, and they can see it in front of their face, when they've used it, when they can smell it. Before then, it's just, well, why are you doing this, and how much does it cost? So I found that specifically the team that Kat put together, somebody who's worked really hard to have a team that could speak to different parts of the organization and reflect who the business was actually serving, which is people in different jurisdictions, people from different backgrounds, people whose first language wasn't even English. You know, having these concepts within the team meant that we were much more reflective of the community in which we were hoping to serve, and actually improve the products which we were delivering.
That's really beautiful. I want to get a bit more blunt for everyone today. You used to drive me crazy.
I did.
You did. And that's because I struggle with perfectionism. And you're not that kind of guy.
Nope.
And Andrew really challenged me as a leader to be better. And I failed more than once, because I fell back on the usual, like, you know, trying to push him to be something that he wasn't, instead of corralling his strengths and then, you know, limiting his weak areas and so on. And it was a really, really important learning curve for me. And that's kind of how leadership and inclusivity and so on, that's how it all ties together. And I'll be talking further on about the personal aspect of it. So, yeah. And I think we became stronger. We have a very close connection. The whole team has a close connection. And it's because we struggled. We struggled through the diversity that we were experiencing and the inclusivity.
Absolutely. Oh, we feel good.
It was, I guess. Okay, inclusion. Oh, I forgot my second point on diversity. Lordy, because I got all emotional. So my second point on diversity, and it's going to be perhaps slightly controversial in light of the fact that we're all part of this system, but neoliberal capitalism has historically not been cool with diversity and non-conformance. You think of a Six Sigma process framework or large-scale low-cost manufacturing, you know, the key focus on maximizing profit margins. These concepts are generally based on people conforming to a narrow way of how things must work. But it doesn't have to be this way. And through today, you know, you are going to see other ways of how organizations are starting to understand of how diversity, inclusion, and belonging can coexist in corporate organizations whose ultimate goal is to deliver value to shareholders. Mostly it requires a lot more flexibility and accommodation than used to be the case. So in summary, on this first point, diversity is everything from race and ethnicity through to what football team you support. Although if you're an Arsenal fan, I'm not sure that I would demand acceptance from my team for your wildly poor life choice. No, I'm joking.
I can't say much. I'm a Crystal Palace fan, and I'm talking to bright people in Brighton.
A good point. Good point. I get off slightly on that because I follow the Bundesliga, not the Premier League.
Oh yeah, I forgot you did that.
Okay, so inclusion. Diversity and inclusion do go together linguistically like salt and pepper. Very rarely do you hear one word without the other, but they're actually quite different concepts. Diversity is about who you have around you, and inclusion is about the environment that you and others create to enable them and you to bring your authentic self to the team. I've got a lot more to talk about, or we've got a lot more to talk about inclusion and what's an inclusive and exclusive environment later on. Suffice to say that this isn't just about good leadership, but it's also being okay about looking inwards and looking at your own personal blocks to being inclusive. Want to chip in?
I think my experience has taught me that different organizations have their own culture, their own organism, as it were. And I felt throughout my career that it was really important to me to either fit in as best as I can or work really well and collegially with the people in the organization. Having spent, my personal history doesn't reflect many of the people from my background. So I'm somebody who came from South London, but left for a long period of time and came back. Having spent time with people from all over the world, you see things differently. And a lot of the work around inclusion, particularly in organizations, is that the focus needs to be bringing people in, making people feel safe in that environment. And I felt that, you know, focusing on that has meant more people are able to access what's in the organization and add value to what the business and what in essence, what the team is delivering, basically.
Yeah, and you've always been fantastic at inclusivity. I think that's a strength of both of us because we're both extroverts.
I think so.
And I'll talk about introversion, extroversion as a diversity marker as well. I think it's particularly relevant in data teams. Moving on, belonging. Now, belonging is not quite the same as inclusion. Interestingly, US leaders in diversity and inclusion are using the acronym DEI these days, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion. Whereas in the UK, we're focusing a lot more on belonging as part of the diversity and inclusion picture. I don't think either's better or worse than the other, but I think belonging is a really important piece of, I guess we could call it a triangle or a Venn diagram with 3 circles. I'm guessing that many of you are aware of, or some of you are aware of, the Harvard University 70-year, I think they're up to probably 75 years now. They've been doing a longitudinal study on happiness. All you need to do is Google Harvard University study on happiness, and you can find out a lot more about that. Super interesting. And what they released their first set of results about between 5 and 10 years ago. And there were 3 factors they had managed to isolate on what it was that were the key, I guess, tricks to being happy. One of them was a certain level of income, which I won't go into in here for the purposes of this talk, but it was below that level of income, your happiness is affected. Above that level of income, it makes no material difference to your sense of well-being. The other 2 were to be part of something greater than yourself, to not just be focused on your own life and your needs and your selfish ambitions and desires, but to be part of something bigger. And the third one was to be part of a community. So 2 of the 3 of this massive sort of world leading study actually are about the concept of belonging. And I think that just sort of shows how important it is to life. And our work life is as much a part of our total life. A little bit about my personal story. I grew up as a devout Christian, and therefore the church was a centerpiece of my entire childhood and young adulthood. And after I chose to leave the church, which is a whole other story, I really struggled to find that sense of belonging in the world that I was in. It's always been very important to me. I have always noticed that when I'm at work and I'm part of a team or I'm leading a team where everybody feels that they belong, it's just incredible to see that in action. So belonging, it's kind of central.
Well, I think it is, and also to teams and organizations and any form of social group, really. You want to feel like you're a part of it and you're all moving along in the same direction. The key thing that I found over the organizations that I found most successful are the ones who've been able to engender that and, how should I put it, break down silos between people and head in the same direction. Even the ones where you'd think is the most challenging in the world, they do have that common understanding amongst each other that, you know, we're able to disagree in some areas, but we're all working towards the same goal.
Love it. Okay, before I do the next 4, Oscar, just throw it to you or anyone. Is there anyone that would like to chip in and ask questions or comments on the first 3?
We don't have comments on the chat now. I guess from my perspective, I'm coming perhaps from a Nordic point of view in this, where community is sort of, it's very often taken for granted and becomes a little bit invisible and not talked about, and is assumed. And you're assumed to have it in the wider world. So certainly there isn't a lot of talk about it in the workplace. It's what it feels to me. And I've lived in California and I've lived in the United Kingdom, but I grew up in Iceland. And I'm just thinking this seems to be raised a lot more outside of my country of background.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I can see that. There are some places where I think if people are very, very familiar, or they all have the same kind of understanding, then yes, it wouldn't be as prescient. I think what I found certainly being in London, there's a lot more in terms of the word culture clash. and one of the key aspects of particularly the drive to technology we're doing now is by being really quick, really rapid, utilizing all of the benefits that technology gives you. It means that people need to build that understanding a lot quicker and a lot earlier. It's not working with somebody for 4 years. It's in 3 weeks. Are we okay to kick this forward? And I found that to be something key in the last few years, certainly. And I was fairly lucky because, as I say, if you have somebody who at the outset has decided that what they're going to do is build a team which reflects certain principles, 8 times out of 10, that's going to actually benefit you later on. And we were fortunate enough to do that in Travelex. In other teams that I've been in, we've been able to do that, sometimes through challenge, and sometimes it's through actually working together, sitting down and deciding as a group, what are the things that are really important to us, and what are the things which actually are going to damage progress in the direction we'd like to go in. But it's great to know things are good in the Nordics. But I think that as time change, as things move on, and as cultures change, I think you'll see that reflected more and more.
Yeah, I don't mean to impart that it's so good in the Nordic countries
No, I know.
and not elsewhere. I just mean that well, personally, I feel rather ignorant. Ignorant is perhaps the right term, but I'm sort of saying the empathy that I'm trying to bring into this is not, it's a learned thing as opposed to I just relax and it comes out correctly. It is what I'm saying.
Agreed. I mean, is there anybody else on the call who's been in scenarios like this where this is a challenge? I mean, I've been in teams which are either heavily male, and we worked really hard to actually, well, I specifically, we worked on teams where we actually went out and tried to hire particularly young ladies to do work in development. Been in parts of the organization that I've been in, particularly some of the startups where we've actually gone to schools and lectured them on this is a future path for employment that you can get involved in. So I can see where there's work to be done. Is this something that you've all come across, experienced?
Hi, Andrew. Hi, I'm Shan. So I work with a startup called Tech Amigos.
Oh yeah.
So on the technical side, so I'm a DevOps engineer, and it's, there's not many women who are DevOps engineers, for instance. I've been a data professional beforehand.
Yeah.
So I think like what's liberating for me in a small company is if I have the opportunity, or even others, to engage with client teams. So we might have our daily stand-ups with internally, but we also have, our stand-ups with our client teams as well. And actually, it's really been really amazing, because you kind of get to appreciate that there's people who have all sorts of different roles, like Scrum Masters and stuff, in this kind of agile working culture, which is really spreading out there. We do need more women, but what I'm finding is that the teams that I work with, they're incredibly culturally diverse, even for the small company I work with, and also for the client team I work with as well, which is, it's a lot of a bigger team. So what I was thinking was, okay, diversity, great, but where we need to grow things is creating that sense of belonging, particularly with the pandemic and remote working. Well, it's always like we need more of a go-to guide for finding ways to nurture that community feel, if you see what I mean. Because you can have themes, like we have Friday Fun, where everyone posts, something related to a theme in Slack.
I get that. Having various different sort of social events and black bag sessions and enabling people to speak and provide value. As you said, it adds that belonging. Having a flat organization, in a small organization, that's a lot easier to foster. In a larger one, it's more difficult. Kat's found that in big global organizations. The same as myself, moving from small to large. But yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's just, I'd love to hear, like, if there are any other ideas for creating that sense of community for like remote workers, then I think that it would be amazing to hear that a bit later on.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, thanks. We'll take that on notice. We do have a slide on belonging and how to create it. So we'll think about the remote aspect of it, which admittedly I hadn't covered. So that's a really good shout out. Belonging has always been a really important thing for me personally, because I've often felt that I didn't belong. Just because of who I was and my background and my various identities. But I've also really, the buzz that I get when I see that someone feels a part of it, I think anyone, you'd have to be completely emotionally illiterate to not see how much it just adds to that person's sense of self when they feel that they belong and when you feel you belong. So, but let's keep moving. Will anyone else want to chip in before we head on to the next four? I got a doozy coming up. All right. privilege? I actually want to spend quite a lot of my definitions explanation time here because this word is everywhere at the moment. And if you're a middle-aged, straight, white guy, the chances are that you've been labelled as having privilege in the last few years are quite high. And it's also possible that it felt really unfair and possibly made you feel a bit angry. Yeah. So I really want to unpack this concept a little bit. The most important point in this is that having privilege doesn't mean you're a bad person, and it doesn't mean that you want it or you asked for it. It simply means that the circumstances of your life gave you advantages that you never asked for. Or as Deborah Frances White of the Guilty Feminist fame says, it doesn't mean your life isn't hard. It just means that your life isn't hard simply because you're white or simply because you're male or so on and so forth. Andrew and I are going to give you some examples from our lived experience right now. So over to you first, Andrew.
I knew you'd say that. No, I think for me, I'm in that position where I've felt grateful. A lot of my peers didn't have the mother, the father, the extended family that I had. A lot of their experiences were pretty challenging early on. So that to me, I always felt quite privileged. But in actuality, in the bubble in which I grew my career in, many of the other people who my peers within my career is a different story. They had other advantages, or as it were, disadvantages. So I think being acknowledging who you are, what you bring to the table, and the fact that there are situations where yes, people have gone through experiences where you haven't had to, is one of the things which I think privilege, it's bandied around at the moment, and I think some of the people, particularly some of my friends, use it and can really see it play out, and it's limited their life chances, their life chances, whereas and looked at privilege as something that they need to address, that they
let me jump in if I can.
Go ahead.
Yesterday when we got together, we talked about this, and I said, tell me how you have changed your life in the UK because you're Black, and you came back to me with an absolutely brilliant example about non-threatening. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, well, the way I'd explain it is, having my background, people from my background have often been seen as threatening. So it's really important that within the first few moments of me meeting someone or introducing myself to someone, I disarm them. I need to be non-threatening. I need to ensure that the impression I give them, they're open and receptive to what I have to say. But I have the foreknowledge that I am Black, I am a man, therefore the natural response to me is going to be not necessarily a positive one. And that's been throughout my life. And that's affected me in different ways. It's meant I've had to use different techniques. I've had to address people differently. I've had to moderate what I say and how I say it, and always consistently think in the back of my mind that I am a Black man. I mean, and I am the only one here. And this is something I think that is common to people who are in environments which doesn't reflect their background or other people like them. Have been able to disarm them is probably a very key thing for me, that I've utilized throughout my career.
It's a great example.
Yeah.
As a white person, I've not had to deal with that.
No.
But I am a bit of a winner at Diversity Bingo. So if you ever want to play Diversity Bingo, I'm more than happy to be on your team because I'm female, gay, and I'm living with a disability. I have a ton of stories. I'm not going to tell you all. I'm just going to tell you one right now. It was from earlier on in my career. I used to be a lot more masculine presenting, so it was a lot more obvious that I'm a big old lesbian. And it was Australia, 20 years ago. And a senior manager at the company I worked for used to regularly ask me unsolicited questions about my private life. And on one memorable day, he asked me questions about my sex life. He was in a position of power, and I didn't feel comfortable telling him to stop. I can categorically tell you today that it was a really horrible experience for a young person just trying to do a good job at work. And I know that the way that I moved about the world for many, many years was based on not alienating people as well. So that I could just feel comfortable and felt like I belonged. And when that was happening, then, good things could happen, whether in friendships or at work. So hopefully those give you a couple of examples from our life. Another point that I want to make on privilege is that it makes perfect sense that you might not be aware of areas in which you have privilege, because systems of oppression are not really part of our school or company curriculum. It's not something that it's getting better, but it's not something that is front and center. The dominant story is that if you work hard or smart and are a decent person, then it's going to, the rewards are just going to come to you. It's just not true. It's not a level playing field. If you're an introvert in an extroverted world, you'll know exactly what I mean. And in fact, it wasn't until I read the book Quiet by Susan Cain recently that I came to understand all the ways in which I had privilege at work as an extrovert. Probably another area that I want to focus on is back to racial privilege. It's one of the most central elements. As a gay woman, I don't need to be out about my sexuality if I choose not to. But race and ethnicity, it's on show for everyone to see. It's not something that you can hide to fit in, and nor should you. So I've been an anti-racist my whole life, just because of who I am and how I was raised. But I was very ignorant about the ways in which I was benefiting from my white privilege. And it's taken, I got a real kick up the arse last year with the George Floyd murder. And I went away and I got uncomfortable. I did a ton of reading. I did a ton of listening, and I came to understand many, many ways in which I was benefiting, particularly at work, from white privilege. And it's something that I'm very passionate about, by using my seniority at work to giving a hand up. Really connected to Black women's tech and data professionals. And it's something that I can do as a white ally, which is actually another term I've got on coming. So does anyone want to jump in about privilege? I'm particularly interested in hearing from those who have privilege, and whether you're where you are in the journey, what it feels like for you. Just before I hand over to anyone, one that I haven't even mentioned, which is really important in this country in particular, is class privilege. The working class versus, I guess, the public school, moneyed class. I am continually learning here and continually shocked about how class is a barrier in the UK to being your authentic best self. So yeah, I'm just going to take a quick pause. Does anyone want to jump in and talk about this topic?
I could say something. I suck at diversity bingo. I guess I guess I could say I'm northern, but that's about it. So when I was introduced to the concept of privilege for white people and straight people, I did sort of react quite negatively to the idea, just because I felt a bit threatened. But it was because I didn't really understand what people meant by it. Now I know better. I'm talking like when I was a lot younger, teens. But yeah, I think when I go back, I grew up in Hull, which is quite a white area, and you know, when I talk to my friends about it, they have the same sort of reaction, especially if they've not left and not really been exposed to people who are different, especially among my friends who are not as well off, because yeah, like that's class is a big issue. But yeah, I think talking to them, they understand it better now. But yeah, you just mentioned you might want to hear from someone who looks at diversity bingo, so here I am.
I love this story, Ash. I love it a lot. And yes, Northern is absolutely a checkbox. No, I'm joking.
I agree with the northern side of it. I've suck at diversity bingo too, being a white cis boomer, gammon, everything else you can say. I didn't grow up in this country. I grew up abroad. My father traveled a lot with an American construction company. So I grew up in Spain, Libya, Pakistan, came back here when I was 11. And I was effectively an American kid who'd never been to America because I went to American schools. I reckon it took me until I was about 29 before I was really integrated into English society again. I knew where I stood. So it was a very awkward growing up in secondary school and so on. But I'm always shocked, for example, when I go to Scotland, obviously the name like this, I've got Scottish heritage, but I worked a lot in Scotland and there are people who hate me because I've got an English accent. I've got friends in the north. When I go and visit, some of their friends are very, very standoffish with me. And I confronted them last time I was there and said, what is it you've got against me? Is it just my accent? You know, I moved to Surrey, so I was, you know, the standard white boomer, Surrey, cis, gammon, everything. Yeah, I still felt I was fighting prejudice all the time. Not in the same way as you, obviously, Andrew, but
I know what you mean.
We all have our challenges.
You all have our challenges. Absolutely.
And I think it's true that all of us will have an aspect of our identity that isn't the norm. And that is what can bring us to empathy to this. So I guess my question for both Ash and Alistair is, you are white. And just before I ask the question, I spent a lot of time in East Asia, both Japan and China, and I spoke both languages. I speak both languages. And yet, as a white person in China, my experience was radically different from the African exchange students in China, radically different. And that is white privilege in action. So I guess my question is, sort of coming at this topic, how have you addressed your white privilege? What does that mean for you? What are the steps now that, you know, knowing that you've experienced discrimination?
I try and include everyone. I was managing a team, 16 people around Europe. I needed a new hire. Didn't really matter too much where, preferably maybe Germany, but I had a real struggle getting female candidates. And for one of the vacancies, I could not get a single female candidate. I was going to HR and insisting that I couldn't interview anyone until they found me at least one female candidate. In the end, I just had to go with one of the male candidates. You know, as a hiring manager, you know that if you don't hire someone soon, they'll take the headcount away from you. It shouldn't happen, but that always happens. I went to hire an Asian guy, and I think I have a strong feeling that someone vetoed the hire simply because he was Asian. In the end, I didn't want to hire him anyway because he was looking at the role as a stepping stone rather than as a career. But there was a lot of talk against him. So I've seen it in action, but I've also seen it the other way. We lived in Libya. My mother used to take me and my two brothers to the market, and she was discriminated against. But in this country, you can't say that you're discriminated against because you're white, because the definition of discrimination is that you're not white, you're discriminated against. And my mother actually worked for Milton Keynes Council and was sent on a diversity course specifically because on one of their training sessions, she put her hand up when they asked if someone had been discriminated against. Well, if it's not discrimination, what do you call it? You know, the majority were discriminating against a minority and taking advantage.
I guess I have been in another diversity and inclusion talk where this topic came up, and my reaction to this is, of course, it exists. Racism does not. Racism, by definition, can only be by the privileged race. If you experience that, then it is indeed discrimination, or what the other word? That's my middle-aged brain coming into action. But my challenge back is, whenever we focus on the small numbers of instances where white people experience prejudice, that's the word I'm looking for, what we're doing is we are effectively saying to people of color, your experience isn't the most significant thing. Your life and your story is not the top one that we should be focusing on. It's like All Lives Matter versus Black Lives Matter. And if you want to Google what's wrong with the phrase All Lives Matter, go for it. Hopefully you'll get lots of analogies that will be really open your eyes if you are of the All Lives Matter crowd. So yeah, I'm sorry that happened to your mum, Alistair. Obviously, I don't know the full details. I just tend to typically say that it is real. And Andrew, if you want to jump in now, I'm mindful of time, but if you want to jump in now and talk about why it's important that we give space to people of color.
I agree. I think that obviously, prejudice and racism is inherent in all people in different guises. I think that in my experience, I've had different experiences. Some have been very, very in your face, really in your face, and others have been subtle, quite menacing, and it's for me. I've tried to take as much as I can. I've always tried to stay positive with a best foot forward. I've tried not to take these things more to heart than I should do. I'm one of the people who because I have an extended family, I have an uncle who set up the Black Cultural Archive in Brixton. It's the only Black museum in England. I am related to some very learned people on this particular subject. And I've always taken the view, looked at it from a personal view. I've been in an experience where decisions that I've made have then I've been talking to clients and they've said the only reason why I'm looking for a cheaper product is because of who I am and where I'm from. I've been in positions where I've gone for roles and people have said, it's not something for you. And that's happened to me. And it's happened to many people like me. But what I believe is the future, and particularly looking at the future for my children, is to do what I can to make as much change to that view as possible, to change as many people's impressions as possible, drive people's fears to the back of their mind, and they have some confidence and assurance that actually we're talking to people who are confident, capable, and knowledgeable, and able to do a good job. And I represent that, and the last 25 to 30 years of my career represent that. So that's how I personally have put myself forward each and every time to try to be the change. And I felt that that's really important. Not sure if that answers your question, Kat.
I think we're in that space where we're just talking at the moment, and that's okay. I guess I might just say one thing, but I also want to stress that this is a safe place for people to share openly. So so it's okay. It's okay for you to explore a topic that may be difficult within this space. I guess my last point is I've also been discriminated against as a white or as a foreigner in both Japan and China. And a really great example is that gay bars in Tokyo, there are actually heaps of them where foreigners aren't allowed, aren't welcomed.
Oh.
But I compare my sort of, I would have really liked to go into that bar, disappointment, I can't because I'm white, to the life expectancy of an Indigenous Australian is 46 compared to the life expectancy of a non-Indigenous Australian is 78.
Yeah.
I think our efforts really need to go into these key life or death things. And that doesn't ever diminish the experience of anyone who's been discriminated against. If anything, I like to think that it helps with the understanding and the empathy that we can learn from.
No, I agree with you. I look at, most people who I've worked with in their lifespan. I mean, by the time I was 18 years old, several of my friends had already passed away. This is something that's uncommon to most people outside of in different parts of the country. But the life expectancy of a young black male in South London is not high. And that's something that I lived through. And it's something that is a fear when I have three young boys. My eldest is 21, and that's a fear I have every day. The moment he's leaving the house to go to university, that's a natural fear that I have, and that's something I live with. And one of the key things as well, interestingly, because this is a data forum, there's lots of data about that. The ONS keeps data about that, and the fact that you can go to Clapham and have two startups which essentially have 300 to 400 million pounds invested in them by VCs, but they have no black employees. Yet they're based in an environment where there are many people of color who actually have native technology skills who would potentially be good hires. They're literally outside the very pan window. They walk past every day, but nobody engages with them. Nobody goes and puts themselves in a position to be a part of their community. And you look at the fact that knife crime has increased in London considerably over the last 20 years, at the same time as hundreds of billions of pounds have been invested in technology. So those young people should be in that industry. They should be utilized. That potential should have been tapped, but hasn't. There must be a reason for that. And this is what people like me think about. This is what people like me face when they set up young black coding females, when friends of mine set up Code Untapped, when we did Color in Tech, when I could go on. The essential point here is that privilege is born out in many different ways. I believe that inclusion, engagement, these are the key things which we need to focus on particularly as a domain, and as we drive technology forward into the future, and particularly data practices as well.
Is this a drop mic moment?
Yeah, yeah, sorry.
Okay, we're going to keep moving because we want to get to the section around practical things to increase diversity and inclusion in your data teams. Before I do, any last comments from those on the call today?
Can you hear me, Kat?
Yeah.
Just a really quick one, which was that in the workplace, I think one aspect of privilege I'm very conscious of is being a native English speaker, right? So I speak English hopefully well, but I'm conscious that in discussions, I work in an open source team, there's people there from other countries, they're not native language speakers, and just sometimes have to think, you know, you have to give them a chance to speak. People have all sorts of wonderful ideas to share from the, as you said, the diversity angle. And sometimes that means don't overcomplicate things, try and keep it simple, but you also don't want to be, you want to be condescending, you know, these are really smart people, we're all really smart people. So that's something I find I have to be careful of sometimes, is just giving space and being aware that I'm very privileged, that I learned English, you know, from the beginning, and not everyone that we collaborate, in fact, a minority are native English speakers.
I think that's the true mic drop moment, Nigel. Thank you. Really good one. Really good one in data and tech teams to be mindful of. Anyone else? Last comments before we move on? Okay. I'm going to do this one quickly. It's a term that may be unfamiliar to some of you, but it's useful as you go through your diversity and inclusion journey. We're complex creatures, as I've said, with these multiple shifting identities. Who we were at 14 is not the same as who we are at 44. And both Ash and Alistair, have given examples of some of their identities. Now, intersectionality is where our underrepresented identities intersect and connect. So it's about how discrimination and disadvantage is highly interconnected. A really famous example is with feminism. The feminist movement has been historically extremely exclusionary of women of colour and the early days of the movement of lesbians. It's simply not okay. And so intersectionality is about saying, if you're a feminist, how can the way that I do my feminism make sure that I don't exclude women of colour in the conversation, and all of those kinds of other ones. I'll give you a very quick example. Recently, I'm currently on the market, if anyone's hiring, and just taking my time to look at other options. I have quite a great network, and I'm working with a recruiter who's a really fantastic guy, really shaking things up, super committed to diversity and inclusion. But he did something that was quite ableist with me a couple of weeks ago. He had a job opportunity come across his desk that he thought I'd be really good for. And he gave it to me. And yeah, the job role looked really interesting. But that day, the disability I have is a long-term chronic illness, foot fibromyalgia, which means that I'm in pain and suffer from fatigue pretty much every day of my life. And some days I have really bad days, and it's called a flare-up. And I'm just, I'm not at the top of my game on those days. So this came across my desk at 10 o'clock on a Monday morning. We spoke at, I think, 4 p.m. and had a chat, and he sold me the role. And I said, yeah, I'm interested. And he asked me to get my application to him that day. I did feel confident enough to tell him that I was having a flare-up day, but because of my own internalized ableism, I felt like that I just had to go ahead and do my best and get that application in anyway. But that was a kind of really subtle ableism that you never would think of. And this is around, I guess, intersectionalities around how you are continually approaching a person as an individual and seeing them for who they are. So I don't know if that example was useful at all, but it kind of reminded me of intersectionality. This guy's super strong on race and female stuff, but he probably had no idea that that was an ableist moment in his life. All right, I'm going to keep going on that note.
So do you identify as a spoonie then?
Spoonie.
What's a spoonie?
You not heard of a spoonie?
No.
Oh yeah, the number of
Spoon
spoons.
theory.
Yeah, spoon
You wake
theory.
up in the morning with a handful of spoons, and just getting out of bed uses a spoon. Having a shower might use 2 spoons.
Oh.
Going to work might use 4 spoons. You might not have enough spoons left to go out at the end of the day. Or if you do, you might be borrowing some of tomorrow's spoons, and you wake up in the morning with only half a handful of spoons. So I've got a couple of members of my family who are spoonies. My son's disabled, and my wife has issues of the same similar sort.
Yeah.
Thanks for explaining that, Alistair. Spoon theory is wonderful. So again, yeah, I encourage you to make a note and look it up.
That's a great one.
Invisible disabilities make up a really large proportion in the UK of people with disabilities. Fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome, long COVID, which is actually ME. It's going to be a big thing in the future. Other autoimmune conditions. Spoon theory is absolutely fantastic for you to become aware of how you can support someone with these illnesses.
Cool.
All right, I'm going to keep going, if that's all right. Microaggression. For a long time, I thought a microaggression was a small, insignificant misstep. That's because I was blind in my white privilege. I've since learned microaggressions can be really damaging. More than once, I've heard a person of colour say that they actually almost prefer out-and-out racists, because at least they know what they're dealing with. It's people like myself where, and it's okay. This can be a really fraught topic, and I really want to get onto the third section around data teams and D&I. But well-meaning people who haven't done the work to understand what the lived experience of a person of colour is, can be typically very prone to making or doing microaggressions. They are often unintentional. I'll give a couple of examples, and then Andrew, please do feel free to jump in. One of the first is not taking the time to learn how to pronounce a non-Anglo name properly. And then a classic example is asking intrusive questions of a person about their minority marker, identity marker. Another one is expecting someone to educate you on their identity instead of going away and learning about it themselves. Just a sample of the many types of microaggressions that exist. Got any more?
No, you've covered the main ones. I don't want to pitch in as many as I can. I think you covered the main ones. There's many, and I think that in the spirit of it doesn't have a spirit of inclusion about it, and if it doesn't, then it stands out, is what I'd say.
I guess now might be a really important time as I move into the last one to talk about intention. Intention is really important, and you're going to get it wrong as you try to be a more diverse and inclusive person, and that's okay. It's about coming at this with a spirit of humility. As I said, I've been very uncomfortable in the last 12 to 15 months as I truly came to appreciate how I was benefiting from my white privilege. And I'm still getting it wrong. And when someone tells me that I'm getting it wrong, I try really hard for my ego not to jump up, because my ego is naturally like, but hang on, I'm trying to do my best here. What's wrong with you? Why are you calling me out on this? That's something that I've also worked hard on. So I guess that leans into allyship and being an ally. It's a term that is in widespread use, and rightly so, because allyship is the single most important thing you can do to someone whose identity, where you are the norm and they are not. I think two areas where I've really tried to work hard on my allyship, and even having my own minority identity markers, is white allyship, which I've talked about already, but also my extrovert. I'm trying to be a much better ally to introverted people, and neurodiverse and people with ADHD. This is an area where I'm actively going out to advance the culture of inclusion, and my efforts are intentional and positive. So there's a ton of information out there. You're going to get hit with 3 pages of them today, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. We're rapidly running out of time, and we've got a really key section to go with. So unless someone has a burning desire to jump in on any of these, I hope this section was useful. It's something that I have never done before in talking about D&I, and I hope that it was meaningful and useful for you. All right. That's not the right slide. Never mind. Let's do it. So this is the beginning of a new section called Building Diversity, Inclusion and Belonging in Data Teams. The title slide decided to hide away. So this is kind of like a pre-step. There are 4 slides in this section. Inclusivity and belonging does start with you. I'm going to just hit 5 steps to personal growth, which is going to really help you become a more diverse and inclusive person, both in the workplace and in your home life, because we do not or should not leave our personal selves at the door when we go to work. Okay, for those of you that are Matrix fans, you should hopefully know this phrase. Knowing oneself is indeed not just for Neo. There's a link there. All of these are hyperlinked, as were all of the 7 terms that I showed you are hyperlinked to further reading. I've been on a journey of self-awareness ever since I was 12 years old, and I'm now 48. Hard to imagine. But I'm still understanding who I am as a person. Andrew taught me something about myself 2 years ago. 2 weeks ago, I'm still learning who I am and how my early childhood impacts upon the kind of person that I am.
Not just you. You're not alone on that one.
It's not easy, but self-awareness is absolutely critical to being authentic. Overcoming shame. Why are you in a Brighton data forum supported by Silicon Brighton? And why are we talking about shame? What? I didn't sign up for this, I hear you say. There's a wonderful link there to a TED Talk on the world's foremost researchers on shame, and I'll be mentioning her a few times. We all have it. So understanding what is the shame that's hidden away, and how is it holding you back from this wholehearted living, this authentic self? It's super critical, again, really uncomfortable, but utterly, utterly liberating. I promise you it will make things will make so much more sense when you understand what your shame is. It's most likely not just one thing, by the way. It's fun with that one. Get uncomfortable with your privilege. This one's not hyperlinked. I've talked about it already. I would imagine that this entire talk today might be slightly uncomfortable, and some of the things that have come up can be uncomfortable. It's really important that you learn to sit with that Andrew, anything you want to say here so far?
I wasn't going to say too much. What I would say is that, you know, the topic as a whole is very much about self-reflection. You can only really change things if you are really aware of yourself and your own drivers and your own triggers. I'm constantly reminded that essentially bringing people into an organization or as a team, as it were, is into your space. So you have to own that space. Although it's not quick and simple, these things actually matter when you are building an organization around you. Having built a startup or having worked in large complex teams delivering major change, all of these principles and values do make a difference into the outcome.
I feel like that was a nice breath of fresh air in 6 points of, damn, do I really have to go inwardly in order to be diverse and inclusive? Yes, you do. All right, wholehearted living. Perfectionism is one of the things that stops us from living wholeheartedly. I fully put my hand up and say perfectionism has been a really major barrier to me throughout my life. Been highly aware of it for a long time. Don't mistake a commitment to excellence with perfectionism. Again, there's plenty of things out there. Another thing that that isn't talked about enough yet, although these links will take you there, is I forget the name of the phrase, but basically it's a culture of overwork where people are praised for being online the whole time, where people, you know, there's this whole culture of putting in the hours to get the job done. Again, there's not enough time for me to explain why that actually strangles innovation. And it can be a very exclusionary culture to do that. So it's rubbish and it's quite ableist. I simply cannot work more than 45 hours a week. I am physically not capable of doing it. So people, particularly at director level and above, at which I'm at, were putting in these 70-hour weeks and putting that as a way that you get ahead. It's not cool. So we've talked about why innovation is really important in data and tech, and wholehearted living is absolutely opens the doorway to innovation. The podcast in which you're going to learn all about this is a 2-part special on the Dare to Lead podcast by Brené Brown. It's hyperlinked to the Dare to Lead podcast. Look for the 2-part special called Armored versus Daring Leadership. Definitely blew me away when I listened to it a few weeks ago.
The interesting thing is, over the last few generations, I'm seeing changes. The younger people who are coming into the world of work have a different ethos, a different methodology, and a different practice in how they do things, the questions they ask. I know obviously things are generational, but it does. I do feel that that's actually having an impact. Obviously, I'm at the later stages of my career, which I don't want to say too loudly, but I am seeing that. And I think, having watched what's gone on throughout the years of theory, constraints, and industrialization and industrial sort of ways of doing things, I think now there is much more of a push towards that ecosystem or organic growth in terms of products, and definitely technology is facilitating that. But again, without the principles behind it and the understanding of yourself, you're not really able to leverage it.
I would echo that. You and I are both, unfortunately, are officially in the middle-age bracket, and it is absolutely true that I see the younger generations doing way better than us on this. Self-compassion is an actual superpower. I am convinced of it. Self-compassion has radically changed both my personal life or my life in general, and has made me a much better leader. Everything starts with self-compassion. There are links there. That's a link to mindful self-compassion. There's a ton of information out there. These are 5 steps around personal growth. There is an absolute plethora of content in the world out there, but these are the 5 that I particularly wanted to focus on. These are the 5 that I have found have most helped me to become a better data specialist, a better leader, and a more rounded human being and happier in my life. So we're going to keep moving because we need to really hit some big stuff here. So 5 ideas for improving the diversity of your data team. We're at a unique point in the evolution of companies right now. Many companies' data capabilities are relatively greenfield, or they're doing major pivots as we speak. It's actually a lot more easier for you to create a data diverse team if you're beginning to build that team from day one, and if you are in that startup space, if you're in an organization that's pivoting. And so to think about committing to it from day one, there's far less friction and change involved than improving the diversity of a mature team.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that given what we said earlier, and the fact that where people are seeing increased revenues, where they're looking at, entering markets with a different mindset, it's really clear that the type of data they use, leverage, capture, manipulate, translate, needs to have that in mind. And the teams that manage that process, deliver that, needs to be diverse from the get-go. And I'm seeing that now myself in what's happening, not just within the technology areas, but even from a board perspective, in who is driving the company and who represents it, and ultimately who do they serve.
Second step, change your job descriptions potentially. Have you read the Harvard Business Review article that exposed that males are more likely to apply for roles when they are not 100% qualified, and women only apply if they are 100% qualified? It's actually an old article, it's 7 years old now. So change this up. Change up how you articulate what it is that you want for the role. Think very closely about the language, make it less prescriptive and more focused on traits. Think about, as I said, language that is off-putting, and also get your HR to do some work on this and go and get them to source examples of inclusive job descriptions or job descriptions that help build diverse teams. Again, there's a lot of work being done in D&I to help support you on this. If I had £1 for every white male who said they couldn't find any women or people of colour for their data or tech jobs, I wouldn't actually need to be looking for a job right now. We're out there. I promise you we exist. There are 27,000 members of Women in Data, which is largely a UK-based network. And not 100%, but quite heavily. In the UK, there are 27,000 members of Women in Data. There's a Tech London Advocates Black Women, which is a very niche group. It's got a ton of members. You get to know who we are before you need and want to hire us into your teams. Again, I've given you some starters down in the further reading, which you'll get. One of the most common lines that I've heard about mandated diverse shortlists, and it's frankly slightly offensive. I don't take offense, but some people do, to this line. We need to get the most qualified person, but we need to get the most qualified person for the job. Now, this immediately implies that a Black, gay, introverted lesbian with a disability can't possibly be qualified for the role. Many of us, although not all, have had to work twice as hard and be twice as smart to get where we are. Chances are we can do the job. No one is actually forcing you to hire a particular person. Shortlists are simply about making recruiters or internal HR teams find as wide a variety of candidates as possible so that you have the best chance of getting the right candidate for your team, for the team that you're in.
That's not always as easy to do.
Yeah.
I mean, I had women on my team, but I wanted more and I couldn't get them.
Yeah.
I mean, the IT industry is very, very male and white.
Yes.
I used to work for Sun Microsystems long, long ago, and of the systems engineers, almost, I'd say 99% were male.
Yeah.
It was ridiculous. Then I joined Dell, and I was just amazed that half the people in the office were women.
Yeah.
It was weird, and it just showed how bad Sun Microsystems were.
Yeah, and also, you know, having been a Unix guy on Solaris 9, my memory goes back. It was very engineering focused, whereas Dell was more about selling their services.
Oh, very much so. Dell, certainly Dell in the UK is a sales engine.
And
Sun was full of technical experts.
I mean, when I started my career, people used to smoke in the office. I mean, you know, it's a different world to what we are now, and
it is.
And as you said, right, it's for me. I went down the road of mentoring and looking for people to mentor, particularly young women going into tech. You know, I was fortunate that I had those links in the startup arena, and working with people like Code Untapped and other people from Neighbor and things like that. We were very much about talking to young people, building those bonds early and fostering what the change we wanted to see. And by doing that engagement, there's now, I think, 17 of them all out in this industry, all working, all at various different things. And obviously that gives me a personal sense of pride. Great. But at the same time, that's 14 people who are in an industry which they didn't ever foresee that they would go into. And when I'm long retired, they'll be still kicking on and hopefully bringing more people into the industry. The challenge is that some of the firms that they'll be talking to, again, there will be managers within those companies who do want to reach out, who do want to be proactive, but to do so takes a lot off your own back. And if you want to make the change, that's what it's going to need. That's what I've come to understand over the years. And actually, you know, Kat did the same in the firm that we were in.
Yeah, this is probably the one point at which I'm going to be a bit hard-ass. There is simply no excuse not to have diversity in data and tech teams. We're out there. Let me remind you, there are 27,000 women members of Women in Data in the UK. So yeah, the rest of me is trying to be fairly gentle on this, but on this one, I'm very clear. You do the work. We're here, and we want to work for you. We've got less than 10 minutes to get through about 25 minutes worth of content, so I'm going to keep going real fast. Building an inclusive culture in your data team. There are 6 elements here. Dr. Amy Edmondson, the Harvard Business School professor who coined the term psychological safety, defines it as the belief that one will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes. I've tried to create some psychological safety just in this session alone. Psychological safety is utterly critical to having an inclusive culture in your data team. I would almost say that you could be not so great on the other 5. If you get this right, you will radically improve your psychological safety, the inclusive culture in your team. Again, there's more reading for you on this topic. Senior buy-in. So the interesting one here is that you don't have to be in an organization that is fully inclusive to have an inclusive culture in your data or tech team. You can create that culture in a sort of a bubble, if you will, to an extent in a bubble, and hopefully be a shining light for the rest of the organization. But what you do need is the backing and support of both the executive and your line management to do it. A classic example is my team at TravelX in comparison to the technology department at TravelX. I had a commitment to diversity and inclusion, and they were both the same executive. And he was supportive of me actively doing that. But the head of technology was less so. It was less a priority for him. You know, of course, that he was a middle-aged white man, and it was able to coexist, and we worked very closely together. Communication. I think because of time constraints, just focus on some of the key words there. Listening is a really key part of having an inclusive culture in your data team. It may be the most important part. I think it competes with articulating and communicating a set of expected behaviours. Those are 2 really critical parts of the communication element of an inclusive culture. You cannot criticise the performance of someone in your team if they are not aware of your expectations for them in that team. It's a really important point. Again, Brené Brown talks about that in her podcast much better than I have or can today. Inclusive language is really important. If you're talking to someone and they mention that they went on a date on the weekend, don't automatically assume that the date was with the person of the opposite sex. Very easy to deal with by using the word they. Try and use the word they a lot more anyway. Gender neutral language is really, really helpful for trans and non-binary folk. Accountability. It's really important that you hold both yourself and each other accountable for those sets of behaviours and the nature of the inclusive culture that you've said that you want to create in your team. Actions are far, far more important than words when it comes to an inclusive culture. Every single individual within your team must know the standards, values, and behaviours you set, and you must hold each other to account. Andrew, you want to talk about this one?
Well, yes. I did have some in mind yesterday, and wouldn't you know, I can't find them. That I'd actually written down, but I think that when a lot of the products that we've built over the last few years, we've moved on from where it was in my earlier career. I mean, I'm now working on a product which we're looking at from a perspective of people who are in nursing homes, and you know, they're over the last 18 months they've been unable to communicate with their families. So how can we, as a business, address their need and build as it were a product which enables their family to communicate with them a lot easier, a lot simpler, with a lot less friction than it does now. And sitting in a major telco, developing products like this wasn't something that had been prioritized previous to this period, which we've all been through. It's taken this to acknowledge that there is a community who's underserved. And having a concept of having use cases who are within the community, how can we serve them better? How can we take what was a standard generic product and focus it? How can we look at our community and reflect them better in what we produce? And you do that by having diverse teams in the first place. People who are able to pitch in at that point when you're developing, or when you're building, or when you're testing, or when you're looking at whether or not something's been A/B tested, and whether or not there's a challenge for somebody, because they've got links to that community. And I think this is something which is more prescient now than ever. And it's something I'd certainly encourage all of the people on the call to do. When you're building teams and when you're looking at not just data products, but technology as a whole, how's it addressed in community? When we were introducing Touch ID, one of the key things that we developed at the time was the ability to zoom up on the screen. And when we did that, this wasn't an initial story. This was something that had prioritized later because of what? One of the developers' mothers had bad vision. When we introduced that then taken on by other businesses, other firms. The product's range changed because people had a link to that community. They understood the life journey of that person and were able to inject it into the development process. So I think this is becoming more and more important as we are, as it were, automating things, as we are going down the road of being more predictive. It means it calls into question who's in the room when it's built, who's in the room when it's envisioned. That's going to become more important, not because it will be out there. The speed to market is faster.
Pretty much summed it up. We've now got 3 minutes left, so I'm going to barrel through the rest of it.
Go for it.
The last point is that you need to measure and adapt. Building an inclusive culture is not a one-off activity. This doesn't need to be labor intensive. It just simply needs to exist. Incorporate it into your one-on-ones with your people. And when you've created psychological safety, those one-on-ones will be real, as will your team meetings. Incorporate them into those and into your offsites. Cultivating a sense of belonging so that people bring their authentic selves to work. Organizational culture is really important. Obviously, you can't individually completely change the organizational culture, but actively choosing to work for companies that have that phrase that you have a place in this company is really important. An example from TravelX, which is not the most diverse and inclusive company that I have worked for. ITV is by far. But the TravelX guys did do some work in inclusivity and belonging. And they would send round to us every time there was a Muslim holiday. They would do awareness training with us. It was very simple. It was an email with links that explained to us what the holiday was, what it means to people of the Muslim faith, and how it goes, common greetings, common foods. So that actually enabled me as a non-Muslim person to improve with relatively little effort my ability to engage with someone and to say, oh, hey, how was Eid with you? Tell me about your family and what they ate, or whatever it is, something that is obviously appropriate. So organizational culture is quite important. The next is flexibility. Diversity is quite uncomfortable. I've given you an honest example from when Andrew and I were working together. It was uncomfortable. And so a team culture and leadership that flexes to allow for everyone to feel like they belong, flexibility is utterly critical. And it's possible. Humans are highly adaptable creatures. So I guess, Sian, thinking about what you said earlier, having a growth mindset, Google growth mindset, is really important in cultivating a sense of belonging. The last point is contribution. So we've talked a lot today about connection. We also want to move, as we grow as an inclusive team, to creating that people feel that they belong, to the point that they are contributing actively to the culture of that team. So things aren't just being done to them. They're not just a passive member of this, but that the culture is such that they are an active contributor. So I'm sorry that it was so rushed at the end. This is the